I've heard nothing from the Prime Minister as to the role of the opposition in Nara. I am just making the point that this is not something to celebrate. This is not something to gloat about. This represents a substantial setback for Jamaica. Madam Speaker, it is a sad situation in the configuration of the affairs of this world that we, living in a small island developing state like Jamaica, are the recipients of the increasingly vicious effects of the climate crisis, a crisis which we did very little, if anything, to cause. The global warming, as a result of the excessive use of carbon and emissions from carbon fuels over the last few centuries since the Industrial Revolution, that global warming has largely been driven by the wealthy economies of the world. And yet we, in Jamaica and other islands like ourselves, are suffering the consequences of that on an annual basis. We were hit by beryl or scraped by beryl last year. It was a serious hit. And this year we got walloped by Melissa. It's really a shame that the international financial community is still approaching the mitigation of the effects of climate-induced disasters on countries like ours by financing packages that are largely based on additional debt. These debts that we are now going to be incurring to finance our attempts at recovery are like lending money to a business that suffered losses through some kind of crisis that is trying to dig itself out of a hole from. Taking on additional debt to do that is going to be a challenging road for any country. Therefore, I don't think it's appropriate to treat these announcements in a triumphant way. We are going to be incurring the costs of paying back this massive additional borrowing in years to come. We are in a country which has spent the last 15 years seeking to get ourselves out of a debt trap, where we've had to run massive primary surpluses every year consistently to reduce our debt to GDP ratio, with a target that's written into our law incidentally by a government from this side, which we were anticipating would have been met this year before Melissa struck us. And now we are facing a new era of massive incremental borrowing. If you look at 3.6 billion US of sovereign debt, that's over 25% of GDP of additional borrowing. That does, and the 662 billion already available, only less than half of that is in a form that's not debt. Most of that is debt as well. This $2.4 billion of private capital, we look forward to seeing whether that will be forthcoming and in what volumes, because you can't project that you're going to receive private investment as part of your recovery. I'm glad that the multilaterals are going to support the effort, but at the end of the day, investors have to be willing and there have to be projects available to them that are bankable and investable. So we will see whether or not that happens. But the reality is that only 12 million US out of how much? $7 billion is grant funding. Only 12 million US out of over 6 billion of programmed US funding is grant funding. That is the world that we as Jamaicans, both you on that side and us on this side, have to navigate. institution which has been announced to oversee the recovery process, which does not yet exist. It is just an announcement thus far. This National, I think, Resilience and Recovery, or Recovery and Resilience Authority, NARA, is going to, we are told, be responsible for the relief resources being spent in a judicious way, in a way that's efficient, in a way that is accountable and transparent, and in a way that accords with a sensible policy of recovery. After all, the PIOJ has indicated that this financial quarter that we're in now, the economy is going to contract by some 11, I think, to 13% of GDP relative to the same quarter last year. That is a massive contraction. And it's going to further exacerbate the debt to GDP ratio because, of course, the debt to GDP ratio has two components. There's debt and there's GDP. So what we're seeing here is that debt is going to be growing dramatically, and GDP is in the process of a free fall as a result of this terrible calamity that has hit us. So while I admire and indeed share optimism about the future, because Jamaica is such a resilient and special country, and we will get through this, I think we should approach an announcement like this with some sobriety. Where this event has caused us to retrace our steps substantially from the economic path we were on, and which the nation incurred substantial sacrifices to get to where we were. I'm not blaming the government for Melissa. That would be absurd. I'm not blaming the government for seeking resources to fund the recovery. It's going to be necessary to get those resources. I am just making the point that this is not something to celebrate. This is not something to gloat about. This represents a substantial setback for Jamaica. And it represents if it's not administered properly, it could permanently weaken our future prospects and damage the country's future. Which is all the more reason why the composition of this recovery authority is important. I wrote to the Prime Minister on the day after the hurricane to suggest the establishment of a task force with broad-based representation, leaders from the private sector and business community, leaders from the churches, leaders from the NGOs, and representatives from the government and the opposition. The concept of NARA is consistent with that. However, I've heard nothing from the Prime Minister as to the role of the opposition in NARA. We heard it will be broad-based, but there is no inclusivity in the dialogue around how it is to be constituted. And I can hear from the barbs that are flowing from the other side that the likelihood is that we will not be included in it. That is what I'm hearing from the other side in their responses to me, their sotto voce remarks. All I can say is, Prime Minister, the opposition represents some 400,000 voters who voted for us, 28 constituencies, and our presence in the recovery and our participation in the recovery, you'll be well advised to seek in a genuine...
House Leader, the member's time for speaking has expired. Members.
Thank you. As the member's time for speaking has expired, I ask that you put to the House that he be allowed an additional 2 minutes to complete his presentation.
Complete your presentation, Opposition Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Another generous allocation of time. Thank you very much.
And Opposition Leader,
yes.
Prime Minister got 10 minutes extra on 12 minutes for statement by Minister.
Right.
And,
I won't be nearly as long.
And you got half of that time.
I'm wrapping up.
Yeah.
It's not in my nature to be long-winded. So, Prime Minister, the point I was making is I think you would be well advised to seek, in an authentic way, the inclusion of the opposition in the governance arrangements over which these funds will be administered on this recovery, because Jamaica is facing an unprecedented disaster, the scale of which is indeed awesome and frightening to those who have to encounter it on a daily basis in several parishes across the land. So, Prime Minister, I wait to hear your thoughts on this. I have asked you about it for a month now. You haven't indicated to me your views, but I'm putting to you today again what I consider to be the optimal approach to dealing with this particular matter. Time is short, and I've been asked to finish within 2 minutes, so I will wrap up now. More on none. We will be hearing about the fiscal rules, and we will be hearing about the suspension of the fiscal rules, no doubt. And I'm looking forward to the discussion around that, where I'll have an opportunity to say some more on these matters. Thank you, Madam. If you had circulated a copy of your presentation to us, because there is a lot of detail and important information in it, and it's much easier to follow and respond to that if we have it in writing. So I'm hoping that that will be done. Minister, first of all, when we're discussing the disaster risk financing framework, I think it's important to recognize the work of others who helped to put that in place. In particular, I want to acknowledge the seminal work that was done by then Minister of Finance, Dr. Omar Davies, in the development of the CRIF as a Caribbean model, a regional model of parametric insurance, which we have been able to benefit on this occasion by some over 90 million US dollars. So I think it's important, and I want to put that on the record of the House, because sometimes those contributions tend to be overlooked. Madam Speaker, we have a fiscal policy paper here, which I look forward to reading, but just on a quick glance at the content of it in relation to the public debt stock, clearly it was prepared in advance of what was announced yesterday by the multilaterals and that very large financing package which Jamaica is being offered of 6.7 billion US dollars. The projections in the fiscal policy paper, therefore, I assume, are predicated on the state of things which existed before that financing became available. And so I join and endorse what the shadow spokesman for finance has said as to the need to see updated projections around those debt to GDP numbers, and indeed our growth numbers, given the additional resources that will be taken on board to finance the recovery. Madam Speaker, you haven't mentioned anything about amending the Financial Administration and Audit Act so as to push back the target date for the debt to GDP ratio to be achieved. The projections you have here indicate that it will not be achieved by the target date of 2028 March, which we understand. But suspending the fiscal rule is one thing, and moving the target date for achieving the desired ceiling on debt is another thing. So you need to tell us when you plan to deal with that. Madam Speaker, I'm hoping that the report that the PIOJ and the Fiscal Commissioner, I believe it is, has prepared, which is a basis for the order that you are seeking to bring here for approval to suspend the fiscal rules, be made available to us so that we can understand the background of this request. Obviously, we're aware in general terms of the background because we are fully aware of the mayhem caused But it would be good to see the technical analysis and the supporting analysis that has taken place by those persons entrusted by our law for the recommendation that the necessary parameters have been met to justify a suspension of the fiscal rules. And I hope in the interest of transparency and good governance that we will see those documents. Madam Speaker, as I have indicated earlier, we are going into a new era where Jamaica has this massive recovery to finance and is taking on a huge financing package to do this. That financing package is largely debt financing, preponderantly so. The Prime Minister indicated that there are shovel-ready projects, or at least approved projects in the pipeline that private sector investors can get behind, and that would be supported by the private sector financing bodies that are affiliated with the World Bank and I think the IDB. And that's fine, but the actual investors who are going to take the risk of making those investments have to be identified. And that is why I'm saying that 2.4 billion is not assured. And we want to hear more about what projects and what investors are going to be coming to the table to undertake those projects and make sure that that component of the 6.7 billion is in fact real. So, Madam Speaker, there's a lot that remains to be explained to us. We don't know any of the terms of this proposed borrowing, the interest rates, the tenures of the loans, any moratoria on interest and principal. From the numbers that were tabled today in the supplementary budget, I can see that certain interest expenses are not going to be incurred. So I assume that means that those multilateral lenders have agreed to suspend the obligation to pay during this period. I'd like to know for how long that suspension is going to last. I don't think that Jamaica has natural disaster clauses in any of our borrowings. I'm not aware of that. That has been pioneered by Barbados in their bond offerings, and I believe Grenada also took advantage of that where an event of a calamity of this nature caused by some natural disaster takes place, there's a period of suspension of debt payments for the duration of the effect of the disaster on an objective basis. And of course, that releases significant cash flow to help fund the country through that period. I don't think we have that formally in our certainly in our bond documentation. I don't know whether there are any public sector borrowings from multilaterals that have it, but even if there aren't, from what I'm seeing in the supplementary estimates, the multilaterals have agreed to suspend some of their payments because we're seeing savings on interest payments in the supplementary budget from the multilaterals. Perhaps you could tell us a bit more about that as well. So, Madam Speaker, I look forward to more information on this proposed order to suspend the fiscal rules in the interest of transparency and good governance. Thank you.